Welcome to Mensan Musing Monday, episode 2, within the Petro Papers podcast. It's technically season 6 of episode 4, but this is my second week of doing Mensan Musing Monday, where I do a balance of a high-level overview and a deep dive on a particular oil and gas topic. I put all the resources in the description boxes on Apple Podcasts and on the YouTube channel. That way you can choose your own adventure and a deeper dive at your own time. I try to limit these deeper dives or musings in 10 minutes because I'm aware of the attention spans that my listeners have, especially with shillennials and beyond. Now let's get to it. I'm going to talk about leveraging AI or artificial intelligence in oil and gas. This is a broad topic, so I'm going to put all sorts of resources in the description box as long as the character limit allows me. I'm going to talk about some of the things or some of the examples of how we leverage AI in oil and gas. When I first saw artificial intelligence or unsupervised, supervised learning, data analytics, data science in oil and gas, I already see that there is an emphasis on the analysis portion of the data. But sometimes the issue is not just the analysis portion. It's just gathering the data to make it consumable for the analysis portion for AI. When I started out in the industry, there was a lot of talk on using statistics for oil and gas analysis. The oil and gas industry is the perfect industry for statistics because we have so much data. However, a lot of the outcomes of the usage of statistics in oil and gas, for example, have been controlled data sets, smaller data sets, refined data sets, to do a proof of concept. Then you want to up the ante and try to use messy data to see if you still get the same insight. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, that there could be different populations of large data sets. So for example, geology, like geologic facies, for reservoir characterization. There are artificial intelligence, or there's a lot of data analytics, data science softwares that can predict log data based on existing log data to get a better understanding of characterizing your reservoir. In fact, when I was an adjunct professor for UTPB this past fall semester at the time of this recording, I assigned that same project by using machine learning to predict well logging data on 1.6 million lines of well log data, or more than more than 130 wells from what I remember. And that is an example of supervised learning. Remember, these musings are not meant to be very organized, so I'm going to jump from one topic to another. But this is using a messy data set, and this allowed students having to clean the data set for the majority of their time before you get to the analysis portion. That's the challenge I see today in terms of artificial intelligence and the usage of oil and gas. How do we reduce our time in the data gathering space or the cleaning space in order to make the data consumable for these analytics tools to develop any meaningful insight? However, there are tools that are meant to tackle in this space, data cleaning. But at the end of the day, this takes some supervised learning. This takes the domain expertise. And I hope this provides some sort of comfort in the sense that there's a fear of AI taking over oil and gas jobs, repetitive jobs, data entry, manually entering data into forms, for example, rather than scraping a form, inputting that data into a spreadsheet, structured database, and getting to the analysis portion of it as soon as possible. The truth is, for an engineer, that only changes your scope of work by spending more time on the analysis portion as opposed to the data cleaning, the data entry. For a technician, that just increases your productivity, being able to go through more of the data as opposed to replacing your job. Your job shouldn't be defined by manual entry and data entry and the whole data mining, for example. And I do think that artificial intelligence is really meant to change the scope of work to make your job better, as opposed to replacing jobs. Now let's talk about the large language model portion of artificial intelligence. This is where the lack of trust in AI comes in, I think, because it goes back to a combination of messy data sets, not having to importing the data that wasn't meant to be a part of a large language model. So therefore you have a garbage in and garbage out. And with that being said, then you end up with these terrible insights from the large language model. So for example, if you put a bunch of latitude, longitude coordinates, and then you put production, for example, the latitude, longitude could be a proxy for geology data. You do a great correlation on pressure versus TVD, you're just getting pressure gradient out of that, if that makes sense. The insight could be the pressure gradient, but we'll see. And then if you're doing longitude, latitude data, and then you're putting production data, and then the outcome is that longitude and latitude have a correlation compared to the production data, that doesn't mean that correlation is a causation. And that is the non-unique issue with leveraging some of these fancy tools in data science and data analytics into the oil and gas industry. Correlation still does not mean causation. In fact, there could be something that longitude and latitude could be suggesting that is correlative to oil and gas production. It's the geology data, it's the specific facies, for example. So if you map the facies with the longitude and latitude into your mapping exercises, then maybe we can get somewhere, but that is where the domain expertise is going to be. So there's another non-unique problem in that domain expertise is going to be compromised. And the reality is data scientists are not going out to get your oil and gas jobs. You're going to be the petroleum engineer who has data science, data analytics, AI superpowers. Just because we're using AI today doesn't necessarily mean that it is AI that is a bot is going to be taking over your reservoir engineering work. That is not the case. Instead, it's supposed to speed up the work that you have, reach the insight portion of your workflow, and then go into the evaluation phase of that insight on something that is relatively agnostic rather than incorporating bias as human beings. So that's where my soapbox is in relation to artificial intelligence and the oil and gas industry. Now, let's talk about large language models, natural language processing, and generating some of the insights with the oil and gas data. Large language models are going to go only so far based on the data that you give. I think if you provide fundamentals of petroleum engineering to a bot or feed a textbook to a large language model to understand principles in petroleum engineering and then feed a really messy data set to see if you can get the same answer, that would be a really cool exercise to have. I wonder if there are entities who mention about this experimentation, and I'll put more resources, whether if we can feed a textbook on oil and gas knowledge and get some level of insight. The other thing that I've noticed is that there's only so much that a large language model can produce. It can search up the things in a petroleum engineering textbook, for example, but can it provide the critical thinking that is reliable in a domain expert? That is something that I think a domain expert is never going to leave in the oil and gas industry. I want to reduce a few fears and insecurities relating to artificial intelligence in oil and gas. Number one, you shouldn't be fearful of AI. AI is only to be feared for if people don't know how much the domain expert is going to be important. In other words, you can't rely on the black box that is AI. Therefore, it is what you make of it. Number two, artificial intelligence is supposed to make your job easier, but that isn't meant to eliminate critical thinking. Number three, artificial intelligence can still make mistakes because at the end of the day, it is what you feed the model. It is what you feed your supervised or unsupervised learning to develop those insights. It is still up to you to evaluate those insights. And number four, I think we should embrace it though. I don't think we should turn away artificial intelligence in oil and gas. In fact, I'd rather we embrace it and we try to find smarter ways to incorporate it to produce oil and gas safely and securely. Remember that all these thoughts are my own and not based on the associations that I'm with. Again, this is Mensan Musing Monday on leveraging artificial intelligence in oil and gas. And while this is a balance between deep dive and a high-level overview, you do have the liberty to choose your own adventure and the resources I put in the description box below. This is a portion of the Petro Papers podcast. Thank you for listening to Mensan Musing Monday. This is Yoga Shupradhan. I'm signing off.